I tried to get a quick glance at how many people had never seen the movie, but it appears there were a number of you, right? Does that mean that you also don't know the story, or you just have never seen the movie, or both? Do you know what the movie is about? Just so we're not talking about stuff and you're looking at us like, what are you talking about? All right, so it's based on a true story, Fred Hampton, and really it's about his murder. And the way that it's told, however, there have been several times that documentary filmmakers and authors have written Fred Hampton's story, or part of it anyway. But what Shaka King decided to do in Judas and the Black Massiah is take a different approach. So it's a dual telling of story, two stories. And Fred Hampton, we learn about him through the eyes of William O'Neill, the FBI informant. So why don't you take it from there and just let us know what attracted you to this structure and to the story itself, actually.
So, the structure, I can't take sole credit for at all. A few years ago, it's hard for me to sort of keep track of the time. I think probably around 2016, I befriended the Lucas brothers, who were stand-up comedians and writers, and they said to me that they had an idea for a movie that they wanted me to consider directing. And I said, what's it about? And they said, well, do you know who Chairman Fred Hampton was? And I said, yes, I do. And they said, well, do you know who William O'Neill was? And I didn't. The story that I'd heard growing up from my parents and family and friends was that Chairman Fred had been the leader of the Illinois chapter, and that he'd been shot in his sleep while in bed with his pregnant wife. And I didn't know anything about, the party being infiltrated by William O'Neill, and the fact that Chairman Fred Hampton was, when they did an autopsy, they discovered that he'd been drugged, and many people believe it was William O'Neill who drugged him. And so the Lucas brothers kind of filled me in on some of those details. And what they said to me was that, and this was like, I thought what was really the brilliance of, the structure was they pitched it as The Departed set in the world of COINTELPRO. And I just thought that was a very savvy way of getting a movie like this made, in an industry that would never consider making this kind of movie. So in many ways, it was the opportunity to kind of Trojan horse this history and this story in a big Hollywood movie that was like a very intriguing challenge for me. And the reason that we told the story the way we did.
So we should say two things, that they had tried to sell the story in a traditional kind of biography, no-go, as you said, and you wrote the script for this film as well with Will Burson. So you're writer and the director, just to be clear about that. So what you saw, the interview that you all saw with William O'Neill was the only one that he ever gave, and he gave it to this team. This is Louis Massiah and Terry Rockefeller, and they worked on Eyes on the Prize 2. We're family because I worked on Eyes on the Prize 1. And they took it from there. And this is from their film. There's actually 2 hours in which they, and you should see the series, talk about the history of the Black Panther Party. One was an earlier show in the series, just to give you a sense of how they built the movement. And this is the 6th hour, and it's called A Nation of Law with a question mark at the end of it. And this is where they tell Fred's story. So the question I have for the two of you, by the way, the two of them shared that interview. You knew you had to get William O'Neill. You also had to know that he'd never talked before. Tell us about that process of trying to pull your treatment together for the interview with him and how you got him finally.
A little bit of introduction to that. Actually, there are 4 other people that are quite important. One is Thomas Ott, who's the editor of this film. Another person is Nolan Walker, who was production associate, researcher who worked on the film. Another person is Bennett Singer, who was the person who doggedly tracked down William O'Neill, who was not trying to be found, but was able to get him. He was a researcher at that time. Now he's an extraordinary filmmaker and making wonderful work. And then the other person is Henry Hampton, who actually was there, who did the interview. So
Oh, I thought that was you. I thought it was your voice.
I did the first.
Terry,
Yes.
I did 3 rolls of the interview,
Yes.
and then Henry stepped in.
Oh.
But I really have to just reiterate the effort it took for Bennett to track O'Neill down. He worked through a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, I believe, who had initially had contact. I spent probably 4 weeks having phone calls with him where he told me I would have to give him my phone number, and every time I had to give him a different phone number to call me at. And he would be calling from a different phone number. And I don't really know why he decided to do the interview. I mean, there are many, many clues. If you watch all of his comments, there are many clues that he felt like he got into a point in his life where he wanted to do something. But it is an amazingly conflicted set of statements. He alternates between saying, I and we, and half the time we is the FBI, and half the time we is the Black Panthers. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know what to call it. What was your reaction, Louis, at the time? I mean, because you were watching him when I was just trying to question him.
one of the things that really stayed with me is after the interview, he came to me and said, well, first he said, how did I do? Which I thought was a kind of peculiar question for an interviewee. And then he said, is he related? Yes. And I was saying, it was who related? I said, is he related? And then I realized he thought Henry Hampton was a relative of Fred Hampton, and that in some ways that this was some kind of, I don't know, washing of the crowd. I don't know. So, but it was bizarre. The interview was in New York. Yeah. And I remember that he asked for first class tickets to fly, and we had to get everything approved by Henry. and so we got it. He was flying from Chicago, first class tickets, and then we realized, somehow we found out that those tickets had been sold. So we thought, okay, we were scammed.
But I think he just cashed them in because we arranged to meet, and then we needed to get a roll of film because we were going to shoot production stills, and we went down to the drugstore, which was just around the corner someplace, and grabbed a roll of film. Remember film before iPhones? Right. And there was this guy, and wearing mirrored sunglasses. And I just knew it was him. I mean, I'd never seen a photograph of him or anything. They didn't exist. It just was clear that he was hanging out. And because he was checking us out. And then we went back upstairs to around the corner to where we were going to interview him. And he showed up a bit later. But I don't know if he was having second thoughts and then figuring out that we were really there, convinced him to do it. I mean, the other thing that must be said is that he died while the film was still in production. Mm-hmm. He was hit by a car running across a 6-lane highway, probably high on drugs. And it made the entire episode of having interviewed him so much harder. Just really, did he do it as a last, I don't even know what to call it.
Absolution.
Yeah. Right. Was it?
Well, back to you, Shaka. The film, as you'll see, has pieces of the actual interview with him at the beginning and at the end of the film. I'm not giving anything away on that one. And what the brothers did was take that interview, because there's virtually very little information about William O'Neill, and then marry it with 7,000 pages of FBI material that they were able to gather. Remember that a lot of this stuff was very hard to uncover. Speak to that, if you would, because that is the basis of your script.
Yeah, it was that, and it was a number of, so it was a number of books that the Lucas brothers referred myself and Will's way, but it's important to note that Will had at the time written a more traditional Chairman Fred Hampton biopic and had done his own independent research. So, he came and brought a lot of information to the table. The Lucas brothers had shared a lot of information with me, and then we kind of like combined forces. And it was all, what was really interesting was how we found out things about William O'Neill, because there wasn't a lot of information about him. And so much of what, with Chairman Fred, people knew him. There've been many books written about him. We were fortunate enough that, we were able to make this movie in tandem with Akua Najiri, formerly known as Deborah Johnson. And she introduced us, and obviously Chairman Fred Hampton Jr., and they were able to introduce us to a number of people who knew Chairman Fred intimately. But it was a lot more difficult to sort of figure out who William O'Neill was, because he was very much a cipher. And you look at that interview, and what you come away with is this is a person who, up until he died, seems relatively uncertain as to where his allegiances lied, even though his actions, I think, demonstrate very clearly where his allegiances lied. But there was one book, and I wish I could remember the name of it, but I paid like $200 for this one book. It was the only piece of research that really existed beyond the interview. It was a book about the relationship between William O'Neill and Roy Mitchell, who was his FBI handler, and it gave a little bit more information about William O'Neill's activities after the assassination of Chairman Fred Hampton, the fact that he continued to remain an informant, the fact that he had two cell phones and car phones in his car, and how much money he made, after giving the FBI the blueprints to Chairman Fred Hampton's, home, and all the information about like the gas station he got from Roy Mitchell after the fact, that he managed after the fact, and him, ultimately like working with crooked cops, killing drug dealers in Chicago. He had a real, he just, engaged in a lot of craziness after the fact. And so that just, we just like found ourselves kind of creating our own sort of like understanding and portrait of this person. But ultimately, we don't even know if what we came away with is really reflective necessarily of who he actually was. It's more our interpretation of the kind of person who might do something like this, which, as crazy as it sounds, I think and I've said this a number of times, tragically, I think that, there are a lot more William O'Neills in the world than there are, Chairman Fred Hamptons, especially, you got to think about when this man, was alive, and just like, the climate that he was coming up in, the conditions. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the times that you're portraying in the film, and also what you were explaining in Eyes on the Prize too, as you laid out the story of the Black Panther Party period and Fred Hampton's assassination specifically. Here's one thing that I just think we have to repeat. They were so young. They were incredibly young. I was shocked to learn that William O'Neill was recruited at 17 years old. So you think about Fred Hampton dying at 21 or 22. Deborah was the mother of his child, she's about a little younger, right? Yes, 18. I mean, that plays a part in the telling of this story and those times. speak to that and trying to, you're trying to, in the documentary situation, make it known that this was a young people's movement. And in the film, you're articulating the same thing, but also that made Fred Hampton stand out more because of how young he was, and I think quite brilliant. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, one of the blessings of working on Eyes on the Prize is that some of the people we interviewed have become friends and also characters in other documentaries. So I'm working currently on a film with Elaine Brown, who went on to be the leader of the Black Panther Party, and she's in the Eyes on the Prize documentary, and she talks about how charismatic, impressive, and just this 21-year-old Fred Hampton, this pure organizer. She actually, I think it's bootleg, but on YouTube there's an interview that we did with Huey Newton for Eyes, and hearing Huey, who was chairman of the party, who was Minister of Defense of the party, talk about Fred Hampton and talk about his importance as a youth leader. I mean, even the Panthers, who were then maybe in their mid-20s or late 20s, could see the power that these teenagers and early 20s really had in terms of sort of guiding the movement.
And incredible inspiration. I mean, what Elaine captures about Fred Hampton's just behavior as a leader, up at 6 o'clock, out there leading calisthenics, saying then, okay, it's time to get to work. We're gonna run the breakfast programs. They had 6 breakfast programs going on across Chicago. And then we're gonna get out and sell the papers. And then we're gonna get to the health clinics. And they had inspired doctors to give free health care. I mean, it was extraordinary.
And also understanding that the Panther Party, although media seems, there's a focus on the guns and the self-defense, but the day-to-day work really was about building and preserving communities. The breakfast programs were not an incidental. It was like a mainstream part. The education was not an incidental. It was like a mainstream part of it. Really, this the preserving and protecting the Black community in all of its ways. Yeah.
It was actually the most what we really kind of learned making the movie was that that's actually what was the most dangerous part of what they were doing, because if people disagree or think they disagree with your politics, like there's no way they disagree with kids being fed breakfast for free, especially kids who are hungry, being fed breakfast for free. And they knew the danger. They were like, they're going to win the hearts and minds of the community, and then we won't be able to stop them. But I think, in addition to him being young and charismatic, he also, as, Terry mentioned, he had the discipline and maturity of someone so much older. And I think that's what made him such a dangerous leader to them.
You had to have some powerful actors, and you did in your film, both to portray him and also Lakeith to portray William O'Neill. Now, I read that Daniel read everything that he could about both the cadence of Fred Hampton and part of that charisma and that organizing appeal. How did you all work together to because he was as charismatic as everybody said, to make that story stand out in this film, make that part of the story stand out?
A big part of that is, I've always believed that, when you cast, a performer, you want to do as much as you possibly can to make sure that there's touchstones between the person they're portraying and the actor. And in the instance of Daniel, he does have a real gravitas to him that supersedes his years and a youthful charisma. He has that in him as a person. And I sense that just from, watching video of him, but then also speaking to people he was close to. But then when he and I met, that very much came across, and I knew that was something to draw from.
6 nominations, 2 wins, Oscar nominations, many other awards. The film was caught in the COVID, so that's probably why a lot of you all didn't see it, because this theater was closed, as were others when it came out. But it certainly picked up a lot of critical acclaim, since then, and much conversation, because a lot of people still don't know Fred Hampton's story.
Can I just add one thing?
Mm-hmm.
The sister that plays Deborah Johnson in the film, to me, is brilliant.
Perfect.
She is. I know it's Judas and the Black Messiah, but she should be up there too.
She was the first.
Really
she was the first person cast.
Yeah.
I wrote it for her.
Wow.
Because I'd seen her on The Deuce, and I just I knew she was a great actress from the moment I even saw her on those HBO programs. And she's, she, just to talk a little bit about her performance, I was lucky in that a number of my actors are also really good dramatists. They really know how to tell stories. And so it was a real blessing to have them on board and be developing the script with them. And in the instance of Dominique, I remember in a draft of the script, she said, she talks about being a poet, but there's no poetry in the movie. I'd like to see her perform a poem in the movie. And Dominique is a poet, she writes poetry. And I said, I think that's a great idea. How would you feel about writing a poem? And then I remembered, we have, and you'll see this in the film, there's another storyline happening alongside the storyline around Deborah being pregnant and Chairman Fred coming out and learning she's pregnant. And, the soon-to-be birth of their son coincides with the tragic loss of one of the other party's members. And I was like, she's talking. Not even she's talking. I remember in reading about specifically women in the party, one of the things that, one of the sacrifices that they specifically made, many of them, was around this idea of motherhood. Like, how can I bring a child into a situation where, and it's in one of the documentary episodes, actually, where there's maybe it's in another, this might actually be in Stanley Clark's documentary. But Stanley Nelson's documentary, pardon me. I believe it's in Stanley Nelson's documentary where he
Black
has
Panther, Vanguard of the Revolution.
Yeah, where I think there's a number of women in the party talking about grappling with this idea of bringing a child into this movement. And I was like, that must have been so stressful for this woman, and then when I spoke with her, she talked a lot about that, what that was like. And I said, Dominique, if you could come up with a poem that could kind of to talk about this other storyline and reference this other storyline, but also talk about what it's like thinking about bringing a child into the situation. I just think that would just like be an amazing piece, and she did, and it changed the whole nature of that sequence of the movie. Because
that's her poem, to be clear.
That's her poem. Yes. She wrote that poem. Yeah, mm-hmm. And I wrote the scenes in many ways based off of the things she said in the poem. Mm-hmm. So
let's talk about the nature of the content of the story and how tough these stories are. I was on Eyes on the Prize 1, as I said. Henry always said that Eyes on the Prize 2 was a tougher sell, because now we're talking about some stuff people just can't wrap their minds around, including an assassination of a young man who was trying to organize. And he got really threatening when he organized all kinds of folks, the white people, the Puerto Ricans, the Black people, the Chinese, all were coming together in a coalition, and the FBI said, this is too threatening. And then we have, on the other side, as the way you tell the story, William O'Neill trying to figure out who he was and what he was going to do with his life. I'm struck by his statement that he made in the interview. I'll let history speak for me, he told Terry and Louis. And I wonder if you think history has spoken for him. And how now to think about how people receive this work, both your work as on the feature film and then your work on the documentary, because these are tough stories now and we're in a different political climate.
Yeah, I think, I don't think history speaks too well of him, yeah, I mean, I think no one I met had a kind word to say about him. And people's main criticism, I think, of the movie, and perhaps a valid one, is that it's too sympathetic towards William O'Neill, which certainly wasn't our intention. But I think for many people, what he did was so heinous that even seeking to explore or allude to any kind of like humanity within that decision is considered problematic. And I think, for good reason, people know it's a Hollywood movie and feel like there's maybe even an attempt to like propagandize that kind of perspective, snitch, like cosign snitching, which I don't think, certainly I know it was not our intent. But the second part of your question was around, sorry.
Just how is it received? How is the story received now? We're in different space. There's also even more material from the FBI files than happened when you guys were doing the documentary and even when you were writing the script. I mean, more and more stuff is coming out. So I'm just wondering now how the story is being received within the context of this climate.
Well, it's such a different climate than it was when we made the movie even.
Right.
So, how it'll be interesting to see how it is received in this climate. I saw someone here who we've been screening. We screened Judas at a number of prisons. We're actually doing a prison tour. We did one prison at Fishkill, and it's part of a series called Cool Hand Luke's screening series. And it's brilliant opportunity, amazing opportunity. And, those brothers really connected to the movie in ways that, I couldn't even have imagined. But it's going to be interesting, when we made the film, I think this was, either soon after or during that time was when you started to see a lot of pushback against like teaching certain, aspects of American history. And I think that that's gotten even more insane and out of control. And we recognized in making the movie that, unfortunately, less and less people read and sort of consume history in the ways that we traditionally have. And so you kind of have to, look at movies like this as an opportunity to just like, not even necessarily like, this is not a documentary ultimately, right? It's a piece of fiction, but your hope is that people then go off and are curious, and if nothing else, just like do a quick Google search of like, hey, did this really happen? And that leads them down some type of wormhole. And certainly that's been the case with some people who've seen this movie. So,
I just think without in any way excusing William O'Neill, it's really important to understand that the FBI was manipulating what was perhaps at the time the most racist police force in America. And it's out of that police force that only years later you get John Burge literally torturing dozens of Black men into confessing and taking life in prison for crimes. I mean, this was a profoundly corrupt police department, and all they needed was the information that William O'Neill supplied about who slept where in that apartment, because they were raring to go in there and do what they did.
I think also we have to think about maybe a broader context. I can't remember the title of Dawn Porter's film. Dawn Porter extraordinary documentary filmmaker, made a film about the infiltration, the FBI infiltration of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. It's no high drama of somebody being killed, but there were so many informants in like NAACP chapters.
Yeah.
So it was not unusual. This was part of the way of sort of controlling a movement, you know. So.
And the absolute repetition
Right.
of that behavior by the FBI in the wake of 9/11 in terms of going after Muslim American citizens is also part of the history that I think we need to see in continuity. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm so thankful for this film that sort of gives a rebirth to what the Panthers were about. And you found a way that you could tell that story. But there's also a long continuum to what repression looks like in this country against liberation movements.
Well, actually, the brothers who brought you the story made the point in an interview I read that continuum, particularly through the Chicago Police Department, goes to, you know, Laquan McDonald, 16 shots in the back.
Yeah.
That was just a few years ago. So if you tie that all together. But I will say that the idea that there were so many informants, Louis, as you said, and as William O'Neill's both character and in person, the real life one made clear, was rather shocking to me, because I really didn't have that understanding, which brings me to the title of the movie. You really wanted to make that biblical reference to betrayal of a community.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it really stemmed from reading this FBI memo that talked about the danger of a Black Massiah, and you know, it just, there was something to, well, if there's a Black Massiah, then obviously there would be a Judas, and then it just, I was like, I was thinking of how do I sell this movie to people who might not necessarily be interested in this history, and that came to me. Yeah.
So I have a question that I've been asked many times, and I answer it the same way, in that you said, Shaka, that working on this film changed your life. Certainly working on Eyes on the Prize changed mine, so I want you all to speak to that. How did it change your life?
Wow. A lot of ways. Like, I mean, I also had to be making the movie when my mother was very sick, and, you know, it was just like it just was a like life-changing time for me. You know, I think I've always loved film as a medium because of the collaborative nature of it. But this was that on another level, and I don't think I'll probably ever experience anything quite the same, just because, you know, I was making something about a real person in tandem with the people who cared most about him, and they were on set 90% of the time, and had very, very specific ideas about what they wanted to see presented, and also had to really just like be incredibly malleable at the same time, with, you know, the needs of, you know, a studio and, you know, me as an artist, and the producers. And so it was a lot of like people to service, and a lot of people trying to service other people's vision, a lot of just cooperation. And it was it's just, I've never, and I don't think I'll ever have an experience like that. That's kind of like tests my ability to collaborate and is as rewarding on the other side of it. So,
Louis?
Yeah, I think just having the permission to really talk to people and to gather and to listen to these stories and to record these histories. The archive itself, I mean, of the unedited interviews, I think are just extraordinary gifts for the community and figuring. And I mean, I think one of the things I very much learned from Eyes is, and really from Black Side, is making the archive accessible is extraordinarily important. And it doesn't have to be, major political figures. It can be neighbors and community folks, but really we have that ability and we really have that necessity to really record the stories and share the history and make it accessible.
Yeah, and I think one of for all of us who worked at Black Side, I mean, Henry was sometimes really difficult to work for, but he insisted on us telling stories in a way that they were meaningful. And I think of there's a moment in the opening of Eyes 1 when Adam Clayton Powell is being interviewed, and they say to him, "Are you suggesting that Negro people should boycott stores?" And he says, "Oh no, I'm suggesting Americans should boycott stores." And it was just making that story and the story of the Panthers, and the more difficult stories of Eyes 2, making them American stories, was
Because they are.
a great privilege for me.
Well, I want to thank all of you. You're going to enjoy the film. Thank you, Shaka. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry.